Hello and welcome. You're watching Global Insights with me, Oh Soo-young. From Arirang News Centre in Seoul, we speak with experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. Throughout modern history, Korea's nationhood has been challenged, shaped, and eventually cut in half after the Korean War by foreign powers competing to expand their sphere of influence. Compared to a century ago when Korea was under the oppressive colonization of Imperial Japan, Koreans in the South have come a long way, having transformed from a war-torn, impoverished nation to one of the world's top 10 economies and a model of modern-day democracy. Yet to this day, settling the inter-Korean War and denuclearizing a hostile North still seems out of reach, and it also draws multiple stakeholders to the negotiating table. To look to the future, it's important to learn from the past, and for this we turn to Bruce Cummings, Distinguished Service Professor in History at the University of Chicago. He's one of Korea's most important and respected historians who's authored the award-winning volumes of The Origins of the Korean War, which was the first of his works on Korean modern history. He came to a war-torn Korea in the 1960s and taught English to school children as a member of the Peace Corps. And for over 5 decades to this day, he's still teaching and working for peace on the Korean Peninsula. It's an incredible honor to have you with us today, Dr. Cummings. Thank you for being here, especially for the 1-year anniversary of Global Insight.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here.
Well, we're very happy to have you here, and well, to go straight into the questions, sir. Now, throughout modern history, it seems that the destiny of the Korean people was largely shaped by foreign powers with competing geopolitical interests. And in your books, you've mentioned how both the US and China have used the division in Korea as a means of gaining geopolitical leverage. Do you think this is still the case today? And do you think the Korean Peninsula will continue to be used as a chessboard?
Well, I think it's true that both the US and China, and also Japan for that matter, are happier with a divided Korea than they are with a unified Korea. And that's a very unfortunate thing for the Korean people. What I would advocate is that North and South Korea find ways to solve their long-term differences and come to an accommodation that allows Korea to be independent and to determine its own course in foreign affairs, rather than the current situation, which is South Korea is very much embedded in the international system, and that's a good thing, but it's also hamstringing for South Korean autonomy. North Korea is outside the international system, and that gives it free rein to say whatever it wants to do, but it would be good if the two Koreas could somehow come together and really make the future of Korea one rather than two.
And while always South Korea's goal has been to achieve peace and eventually unification with the North, but for other countries, the United States and other stakeholders involved in Korean affairs, the goal is simply denuclearization. So how do we merge those two different goals? Is that even possible?
Well, I think it's true that no great power, whether it's the US or China or Russia or Japan, none of them really have any interest in a unified Korea. And therefore, it's incumbent upon Koreans to understand this and grasp a situation where they become the masters of their own destiny, rather than, I mean, it's ridiculous to imagine that Japan or China or the US or Russia would still have an interest in a divided Korea. What's most important is that Korea itself come together and unite to make a great nation.
previously mentioned the failure of the Obama administration's North Korea policy of strategic patience, as well as its assumption that the Kim regime would one day implode by itself. Are you hopeful about the new Biden administration? How would you advise the new government on engaging the North?
Well, I mean, the policy of strategic patience wasn't much of a strategy, and it wasn't very patient. It essentially decoupled the Obama administration from doing anything about North Korea for the last 3 years of Obama's presidency. I don't blame him for that. I mean, I understand that North Korea was very provocative at the beginning of his administration with nuclear tests and missile launches. But the fact remains that North Korea is the last serious problem that I'm aware of that the Biden administration has said nothing about and have nothing to say so far. But I'm afraid that they will continue with a policy of very strict sanctions and waiting for North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, which is never going to happen. And the solution has to be to cap the North Korean nuclear program, to keep it from that point at which it's capable of launching a long-range missile with a nuclear warhead at the United States. So far, they haven't demonstrated that they can do that, and it's very important to keep them at that point and to cap their nuclear program and to generally normalize relations with North Korea. I mean, the fact is, it's 75 years, going back to February 1946, when Kim Il-sung became the head of the interim People's Committee, the Central People's Committee. It's when he basically came to power. And the U.S. refused to recognize him then and have refused to recognize his sons and his grandsons ever since. And it hasn't worked. I mean, North Korea has not done anything positive as a result of all the sanctions that we have put on them. So it's time to try a very different policy.
Well, March 1st marks the 102nd anniversary of Korea's declaration of independence from Japan's colonization in the early 20th century. And of course, this declaration made on the 1st of March 1919 inspired the 삼일운동, meaning March 1st movement in English, sparking a series of non-violent protests across the nation against colonization. And of course, Korea didn't gain independence until 1945, when the Japanese were defeated in World War II. But what significance and influence did this movement have for other colonies around the world at that time?
Well, the March 1st movement was one of the first independence movements among the colonies. One of the first, along with Egypt and the Irish at the time, one of the first big strikes against colonialism. After World War II, dozens of countries were up in arms about colonialism, but Korea was one of the first.
The Korean narrative over the decades, it's been constantly undermined by foreign countries and other foreign actors with interests and their own interests. And well, a couple of weeks ago, a Harvard law professor produced a rather controversial entry to the International Review of Law and Economics, where he claimed that Korean victims of Japan's wartime sex slavery were voluntary prostitutes with rather competitive salary schemes. What were your thoughts on this piece of work by this man, J. Mark Ramseyer?
Well, it was ridiculous. I mean, it began with an absurd premise, which is rational choice theory, and the idea that women were making some kind of choices amid their oppression under the Japanese. And secondly, his facts were just completely wrong. He not only I wouldn't say misunderstood, he just completely misconstrued the existing record and paid no attention to the work of any number of scholars. And I have to say, it was just an embarrassment to have to read this after so much, decades of research by Japanese and Korean and American and other scholars into the history of sexual slavery. To read that this person seems to think that 13 and 14-year-old women chose to become prostitutes instead of being completely dragooned into a slavery situation in which they would take on 40 Japanese military people per day. There isn't a woman in the world who wants to do that, and the idea of free choice here is an absurdity. I really don't know how that review was published. It couldn't have been published by anybody that knows the existing historical record, the scholars, and the government documents that we have about sexual slavery by the Japanese.
It must have been very upsetting for you as a historian, and well, we largely think that it really undermines the progress that we're trying to make in restoring bilateral ties between South Korea and Japan, in moving forward in their relations, and after various failed attempts, of course. And when we look at their bilateral ties, there's a huge contrast with Germany and the rest of Europe, for instance. Germany sought the forgiveness for its wartime atrocities in the Second World War across the continent, and it's constantly demonstrated a spirit of contriteness, and it is now arguably a force that really has the trust of its neighbouring countries and ultimately ties the European Union together in political and economic union. What do you think would be the first step to reconciliation that Korea and Japan could take or really learn from this?
Well, you're right that Germany has done much more than Japan to investigate and apologize for its terrorism and war crimes in World War II. The problem with Japan is that you have a one-party democracy in which people like Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, former Prime Minister, and his grandfather, Kishi Nobusuke, that these folks with tremendous American support have ruled Japan for 70 years. And you can't expect from them that they're going to try to understand and explicate and apologize for the crimes that Japan created in World War II. You can't expect it because we've been waiting for it for I don't know how many decades, and it hasn't appeared. But thankfully, there are many Japanese historians, independent, who have continuously sought to bring to light the crimes of the Japanese imperial period. And I think it's great
well,
that a kind of accommodation between Japanese historians who are independent and Korean historians has come to a general understanding of the crimes of the Japanese and how to somehow find a way to exculpate them.
So it's rather unfortunate that the conversation between the governments, they've not been constructive, but purely political, it seems. And well, now lastly, looking back on the March 1st movement 102 years ago, South Korea has really come quite a long way, marking milestones in its socio-economic development and democratic transformation as well. And of course, you're a historian, but if you were stepping into the shoes of a futurist right now, how would you depict South Korea's position in the world for the next few decades? What kind of role do you see it playing in the international community?
Well, South Korea has been great in its economic development, its developmental model, its ability to continue competing, for decades now with Japan and Taiwan and China. I have nothing but respect for what they have done. I still think there's a huge problem in the Korean economy with the domination of the chaebol or conglomerate groups, which occupy an enormous 75–80% of the Korean economy. But the fact remains that among developing countries, Korea has done very well. And I just wish that somehow the great intelligence and really greatness of South Korea's development could be combined with North Korean development, so that Korea as a unified country could have an even greater impact in the 21st century than it has now.
Well, this is where we'll end the interview today. Thank you so much for your time. That was Bruce Cummings, Distinguished Service Professor of History at the University of Chicago. Again, thank you so much for your time today. It was an incredible honor.
Thank you very much.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you for watching.